Good morning and welcome to the program. This is Moneyline with Nancy Ayanam, and I am Nancy Naji. Today on the program, it will be a very brisk one. We will be bringing to you a conversation that was held just a few days ago here in Abuja, which I moderated, and the conversation was about identifying Nigeria's challenges as well as what will be the future opportunities. Don't forget that the next few days a new government will come on board. What are the economic challenges that the next government will face, and what are the solutions? So this panel session, it was a high-level panel session. We had the Governor of Anambra State, Professor Chukwuma Soludo. We also had the Governor of Kaduna State, Governor El Rufai, as well as Mr. Aigboje Aike Mokwede, who is the chairman of Coronation Capital, as well as a co-founder of Access Bank PLC. We had the country director of the World Bank, Dr. Shubham Shaduri, as well as Dr. Zainab Husman, who did her book presentation, Economic Diversification and Nigeria's Post-Oil Future. In her book, she was trying to x-ray what are the obstacles that are impeding Nigeria's growth as well as development, and also offered solutions. It was such an interesting conversation, and I can't wait to bring you that. So let's quickly take that. Professor Soludo, you are Anambra State Governor. One of the economic hubs in the country is in Nnewi. I heard someone say, over here. Over in Abia State, we have Aba and all of that. So you have economic hubs around the country. What is rapidly activity in order to build these businesses, these clusters, make them internationally competitive, and provide good-paying jobs for millions of young Nigerians?
I want to say Nnewi, for example. Nnewi is one of those paradoxes and tragedies of the country. And it's an illustration of, and a case study of where firms, private sector, have tried to industrialize in spite of government. Then weight, the octopus weight of government, try to constrain them to what I call a low-speed trap equilibrium, as it were. That's national tragedy. What has been missing, and why Nnewi is where it is that there has been a lack of a national strategy for export-led industrialization. We don't have this strategy, and there is no focus on that. The infrastructure that you need to do that, access to long-term finance, the macroeconomic environment, transport and power sector, and everything else. We need deliberate strategy for export-led industrialization. And that's kind of, if you begin to have an institutional framework, let's have the El Rufai's committee, the APT. That is what I call the minimalist. The recommendations of that committee is minimal that will require to begin to unbundle and make transactional politics less attractive and concentrated at the center. And then you can unleash the potentials at the base. Even from Anambra, we're doing everything. There is the federal government has signed up with us on automotive in the government for over 6-7 years now. It's still in the books. It's still yet to come. And the state is constrained because the federal government is overlooking over there. The macro framework make it difficult for people to have access to long-term financing, as it were, even globally, and so on and so forth. So I think part of this quest for transformational leadership, transformational agenda, which I'm very happy to know that with the new government now coming into place, it has a chance for a fresh start. And it has to start with assembling the team. and getting to work on this institutional line that unbundles and tries to, if you like, devolve several of these powers and concentrations at the center. You can't run Nigeria, everything from Abuja. It's impossible. And we need to now unleash the competitive force at the lower levels to also work. And enable those institutions to also experiment and grow. We are afraid that, oh, the states or the local governments can have this and so on. You can't grow letting it. The only way we have a country is to let us experiment, fail, experiment. And that's how other countries have developed. You must unleash the base for you to have competitive systems. You cannot have a competitive economy without having a competitive system. And for me, that will be the beginning point to getting NEWI and getting all the other such clusters and so on and so forth to get on a path to sustainable development, sustainable transformation, long term.
Thank you very much, Professor Soludo. So, Governor El-Rufai, Professor Soludo acknowledged the work you did during, of course, as FCT Minister and as the DG of BP at that time. But what all of us in this room can acknowledge is that politics influences economic decision. I would like you to speak about, based on your experience, what the difficulties are in executing difficult reforms. How can a consensus be achieved and sustained on the critical agenda of economic transformation? If we take a look at, for example, the issue of fuel subsidy has been on for many years. I remember Khalifa is seated here. I remember those days, Khalifa and the former Minister of Finance, Okonjo-Iweala. I interviewed them then. It was removal of subsidy. We're still talking about it now. How many years? 11 years again. So how can a consensus be achieved?
Zainab's book is perhaps, in my view, the most important book about the Nigerian economy in the last 1 or 2 decades. It truly looks at the problems, and as Professor Soludo said, you know, she's right on the money. She got it. It's all politics. Politics trumps everything. And if you don't have the proper political settlement, it becomes extremely difficult to have a lit consensus, to have long-term plans that everyone will buy into across party lines and so on. And it just becomes, you know, based on accidents and luck. I was part of that one accident that everyone is talking about, the second term of Obasanjo and the aftermath, when we exited London and Paris clubs, we averaged 7% annual GDP growth for a long period. And Professor Soludo's suggestion that perhaps we should not despair, but look at that period and see what did we do right. Because it means Nigeria can do it. We can replicate this. It was all Nigerians, and it was a Nigerian president. It was a 4-year election cycle. But we're able to do so much in that period and laid a solid foundation for our successors. But something went wrong somewhere. I think there is a need to study that and then understand it. We can talk about it. Some of us that were part of it. We can talk about it in a few words. I think political leadership matters. If you don't have political will to take very difficult decisions that may be unpopular in the short term, but solves long-term problems that the rest of the people may not see, but you know it has to be done, then you are in good shape. Secondly, if you have political leadership that is legitimate and strong will to pursue difficult decisions, you need a competent team. You need a solid team. The Nigerian cabinet consists of something like 40 ministers. You don't need more than 10 solid ministers to move the entire cabinet along. And what Obasanjo did in his second term was to pick a few of us that had no political ties, but had a track record either in the private sector or development community and so on, and put us together and said, I want to get debt relief, okay? Do whatever you can to make sure we get debt relief. This was the crisis that compelled Obasanjo in his second term to focus. And this was what gave us, as the economic team, the leeway to do anything we wanted. There was nothing we take to Obasanjo that he would not approve, because he wanted to go down as the president that eliminated Nigeria's foreign debt, which has been an albatross for 2 decades. And Ngozi gave us the leadership. She assembled the team. We were all technocrats. We were not political. Obasanjo handled the politics. He backed us up. And that's why we were able to do what we did, okay? We were lucky oil prices started rising, but we saved the excess revenues. We ensured the exchange rate was actually undervalued. You know, the team was very disciplined. So you need leadership, you need a competent team, and you need to communicate and explain to people what you're doing, because often people are willing to support the government. Nigerians are very supportive of their government if they understand what you're doing and they can see light at the end of the tunnel. So to me, this is an outline of what we should be looking at. But this issue of political settlement is a very important issue, and we must come back to it. And in very practical terms, okay, we have to, as politicians, as political leaders, face our problems and be realistic about our problems, have realism about our situation, and be pragmatic about our solutions. And then we should agree across political divides, focus on those solutions, and just get on with them while explaining to the people what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing. People forget that in 1954, our leaders, our political leaders from Nigeria went to London and agreed on what Nigeria's federal structure should be. And when we got independence, that structure worked. The regions were competing. The center was focused on a few things that it was doing well. The regions carried most of the responsibilities, and the revenues were distributed in favor of the regions so that they would handle the bulk of that. That was the political settlement that our founding fathers agreed. If Nigeria wants to have a political, the kind of political settlement Zainab is referring to, that will enable us agree on certain things and work on them no matter what, we have to go back to that political settlement of 1954-55 and devolve more power, responsibility, and revenues to the states, and narrow the size and scope of the federal government to things that it can do very well on behalf of the federation, and leave most of the responsibilities to the states. Okay? And we made recommendations that will move in that direction in 2018, but somehow, again, because of political will, it was never implemented. In my experience in public service in the last 20 years, the biggest impediment to implementing policies or even formulating sound policies and so on is the nature of our politics. Okay? We have a political culture that has no regard for public service, that's driven by pursuit of personal interest, and most of the time, okay, enrichment of my state or my ethnic group is a toxic political culture that has developed. And until we find a way to address it as politicians, some code of ethics that should at least say, let's agree that education is important, health is important, infrastructure is important, and we should not be spending 10 times the amount of money on subsidy, for instance, than we are spending on health, education, and infrastructure combined. Okay, so it has to start from politics, it has to start from politicians.
It seems that we all know the problems, but the question is, how do we solve them? So that we don't start rehashing questions or questions. No, Governor, I'll come back to you later.
Yeah.
No, I want to come to,
no, I just want to respond to that quickly.
Okay.
You know, in my view, I've told you the how. Okay, the how is, let's look at what happened in 2003 to 2010.
So what's distorting the how? Because you mentioned we have a transactional politics. How do we clean up the political class? How do we clean up that system? But that will be another question. Just ruminate on it, because since you are the only politician here physically present on this panel. Mr. Imokode, let me come to you. It seems the private sector background, so perhaps we'll dilute this a bit, you know. With your experience, you know, based on your vast private sector experience as Chief Executive Officer of one of the top financial institutions in the country, and now as the head of one of the top foundations focused on public sector. What is this about public, private, state business relationship that needs to improve? In what areas should Nigeria's public sector really step up its provision of public goods and better facilitate private sector in achieving economic transformation? What we've also seen over the past few decades is that there seems to be a dearth of trust between private sector and public sector.
Thank you. And I think it's necessary to kind of understand what Zainab has said, what Prof is saying, and what Malam El-Rufai is saying. Your history, in many ways, defines your future. In many ways. Okay? And if you think about economics, some of the most important economists have been what they call economic historians.
Yeah.
Okay? And there's a reason for that. Now, there are 3 periods where our nation has performed. Just before independence, 58 to 66. Slightly after the Civil War, 72 to 79, 80. Okay? And basically 2000, 2007, 2008. Okay? I have studied those periods. But let me tell you why, as a private sector person, I have studied those periods. If you put private sector players in Nigeria in a room, they will tell you, we are the engine. We are the engine of the Nigerian, let's say, not even the economy, the Nigerian competitive context, okay? And if you want to take vehicles as that analogy, okay, Nigeria is a vehicle competing with other vehicles, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. And I believe that certainly the private sector is the engine of that vehicle. But then the vehicle also has other parts. Wheels, a frame, it has passengers also, which are the citizens. But most importantly, all right, a vehicle doesn't move unless it's started. A vehicle goes in the direction that the driver takes it. And when you think about a driver, you also think about a driver and the driving team. All vehicles are driven by government. So however powerful that engine is, 1 billion horsepower, okay? If your driver doesn't have the capacity to handle the car, right? That's what's going to dictate how far you move and how fast you move. Now, let me also tell you something. It's not one person, it's not a president, it's a government, okay? So if you think again about the analogy of the vehicle, think about all those civil servants you take for granted, those public servants, and imagine that they all have the power to pour fuel into that vehicle. It could be a diesel engine. They pour petrol inside. You see it now? Aha. Okay? All right? They don't know that there's a cliff in front. Okay? However powerful the engine is, you're going to drive over. And the problem is this. If we go back in history, there was a consensus that came out of an enlightened understanding that for Nigeria to work and perform, that every other nation that has performed has, is that you must have equal capacity in the public sector and the private sector. And when I left Access Bank, having seen this reality, even in the banking sector, you refer to my book. In my book, I said, see, the success of banking in Nigeria is as much, yes, the success of us as CEOs, but really the success of that team, that government at that time. And in my book, I said, the reason why I did everything to buy a bank when I did was that spending time with that team, with Ngozi, with Professor Soludo, with Malam El-Rufai and co, I knew that if I missed this moment, to be handled, however skilled I was as a private sector person. So we did everything to get into banking at that time. Okay? So if you think about the how, we have to go back to the type of understanding between the private sector and public sector, which back again, I will go back to in 1960. We said this nation will be run through 3 regions largely. One small one where I come from, Midwest, you know, appeared. Okay? And we would focus on making the Nigerian dream come true. There was only one thing that these people realized, that you are competing. And to compete, therefore, you had to have your best. Now, let me describe the 3 or 4 heads of civil service in the regions. Ali Akilu, Udoji, Simeon Adebo, and another man called Joseph Imokwede, who just happened to be my uncle. That's not why I've started supporting the public sector. Now, common to all of them is incredible capacity. Some of them were given awards by other countries. Some of them, when they died, their obituary notices were in the New York Times. That is the type of capacity for the work they did in Nigeria. Now, when you think about the Western region and how it developed, if you see the numbers of outstanding men and women developed by Simeon Adebo, come to the north. Have you heard of the name Ali Akilu?
Yes, I have.
Okay. London School of Economics. I mean, this is a wonderful, talented man by any global standard. The power to be was a Kano man. Everybody in Kano came here. That's what happened. When we made the rentier economy more important than the real economy. When our priorities were no longer who is building textiles, who has the cotton mills, who has the tanneries in Kano, and more about who is going to get the next contract. Okay? And that's what we celebrated. That's our nation today. Now, can we fix it? Of course we can. Do you know why I think we can fix it? Okay? Nigeria is the most blessed country in Africa, given our people. Okay? There's a reason why Ghana has gone to the IMF 16 times since independence. And anytime it comes to Nigeria going to the IMF, we're ready to almost die before we go. Because we believe in ourselves. We're dynamic. We're very entrepreneurial. Most importantly, we're very patriotic. So what you are hearing from these speakers before me is that we have a new government come May 29th. The only way that government will perform is if we go back to those roots in 1954 that he spoke about, where merit, okay, in the interest of this nation flying or that vehicle competing better than all the other vehicles is what determines how this government that comes in will be run.
I thought I would get a round of applause for Mr. El-Timothede. Thank you very much. Now let's come over to Dr. Shaduri. The World Bank is one of Nigeria's important development partners. In fact, your motto is fighting poverty. Over there in Washington, you see it on the floor. And sometimes when I pass, I'll be like, how long have the World Bank been fighting poverty? Over 70 years. I hope you're so successful. But you assist Nigeria in many analytic outputs like the Nigeria Development Update, the Country Memorandum, and all of that. My question to you is, what type of policy reforms have proven the most difficult for Nigeria to implement? I see Shubham is winking at me. Nancy, you want to ask me that question? What type of policy reforms are really difficult for us to implement in order to diversify and restructure, like Governor El-Rufai mentioned earlier, based on the analytical output as well as the advisory work that you've done? Are there comparative countries such as Indonesia, Brazil, India, that we can learn from? What have they done that would also make us overcome some of these reform constraints?
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, Zainab and Waziri, for including me on this. I mean, I'm actually wondering. Governor El-Rufai said he's wondering why he is. He's just being modest. I truly am wondering why I'm here. I mean, in part, look, usually the World Bank is brought in to provide this international experience, but I want to note that you've done that in the book and in the presentation, and you were at the World Bank at one point. So, but let me turn to the question that Nancy asked. Look, I can answer that question in technical economic terms, or I can answer that in more political terms. So
okay.
Let me take the first. Technical economic terms, and let me just take two countries as points of reference. They happen to be two countries that I know the best. I'm from India, so I know India, and I spent 5 years in Indonesia. But I also think that those two countries, India and Indonesia, are in some ways the best kind of comparator or peer countries for Nigeria in terms of being large, ethnically, religiously diverse, noisy, multi-party democracies. Indonesia and Nigeria are even closer. You know, they have a similar history of 30 years of military rule, a transition to, you know, this noisy democracy in the late 90s, etc. So those two countries. In economic terms, at some point in both Indonesia and India, two basic facts or kind of realities of policymaking and development, I think, were agreed on by the elites. One is macrofiscal, kind of core macrofiscal management. In Indonesia, this was triggered. There was a period of that in the military rule during the Suharto era, but more than anything else, it was triggered by the 1998 Asian financial crisis, where Indonesia had to go to the IMF. And that was at the national level, whether or not people supported Suharto or sympathized with him, this was a thing as a national trauma. And since then, if there's one thing that the political elites agree on, it's the need for proper macrofiscal management. Does not mean, you know, everything's solved, but that one thing that we are not going to get into that kind of macrofiscal crisis again is something that's shared by all the elites. Second thing I would say, and then here let me refer to the example of India, is a basic understanding or commitment or recognition, I would say, of the role of private investment in a nation's development. No country has eliminated poverty without private firms growing and creating the jobs that pull people out of subsistence agriculture, pull people out of kind of hustling on this, you know, informal sector. Okay? It is always private firms growing and investing. In India, there was the suspicion of private investment. You know, we came with a socialist kind of mentality out of independence, and somewhere in the early 90s and through the 90s into the 2000s, that changed, that light bulb went on. So in technical economic terms, these are the two things that, you know, India, Indonesia, where they, you know, that recognition amongst transactional politics, or you can be reelected based on delivering development. So I'm not saying it's completely one way, but at a root, there has to be a political consensus or a political settlement or elite consensus that everyone, including the elites, will have a bigger piece of the pie if the national pie grows. So I've said this before, I've worked in every country in Asia. What separates out the countries that have actually embarked on this dynamic upward trajectory of, you know, inclusive growth and prosperity are the ones where the elites, it's not that they're any more or any less self-interested, they're just a bit more longer term oriented, recognizing that by growing the national pie, that's the way to have a bigger piece of the pie. Okay? And that requires trust amongst the elites. So let me end with this. It's ultimately a political statement. You know, people talk in Nigeria about the trust deficit between the state and the citizens, or between private firms and the government. I think the most fundamental trust deficit is within the elites. Okay? All right? Because we are in a situation where, in economics, we call it tragedy of the commons, which is a situation where within a community, everyone recognizes what's the right thing to do, what will benefit everyone, but if any one person tries to do the right thing and the others don't follow, then they're going to be worse off, okay? Fishing communities that overfish, as a result of which the fishing grounds are, you know, laid barren. That's a classic tragedy of the commons, right? In a sense, that's the kind of problem that Nigeria is wrestling with. You can call it a political settlement, lack of an elite consensus, but until there is that collective, you know, trust amongst the elites that it is in everyone's collective interest to do the right thing, to do transformational politics as opposed to transactional politics, you know, the pie will not grow bigger. In fact, there's a risk that the pie will continue to shrink. Okay? Now, how do you change that? I think that's where, you know, the other speakers here will be much better. But it's a how which is ultimately political.
Okay, Dr. Usman, you want to come in here?
Is it on? Okay. I just want to respond quickly, and by way of thinking about solutions, I think I want to reflect on just my experience doing this research and what I found. Going through, you know, I did archival research. I read a lot of the pre-independence and post-independence policy documents, speeches. You know, there are people I spoke to, people who have played roles in the 60s, maybe not 60s, it was 70s, 80s, etc. And what stood out to me is this idea of, you know, whether it's a consensus or the political settlement. It's not that it has not existed. It's just that even when something is forged, it does not endure. It breaks down, it becomes fragile, and then yeah, we end up having what we have. So the key question is, and I don't know if anyone else in the audience can come in during the Q&A session to talk about why is it that there tends to be these military consensus, that I talk about it in a lot of flack, and I started off that way, but then down the line, I started to have some sympathy for some people, the challenges they face. You had a country collapsing, what were you gonna do? Right? You could also argue that some of them played specific roles, but you know, you just had to and this is the thinking of the military, kind of bring everything together under a central command, and that held for a certain period, and then it collapsed, right? And then the early 2000s that I spoke about, there was, you know, all of us were alive at the time, we remember that there was a certain kind of consensus and cohesion that is hard to find now. So what happened? Why do we have these frequent breakdowns, and how do you prevent that from happening? Then when you are able to secure that consensus, how do you identify the crucial policy reforms that have to be elevated above politics? I think this is what you find in some other countries, and I want to talk about Botswana, for example, that you have one political party, people change, but there are certain things that they will not touch in that country around the way they do their mining development agreements. And again, you can quibble about Botswana being still dependent on diamonds, but they don't have the kind of poverty or the certain kinds of instabilities you find in Nigeria. So how do you forge that consensus, prevent it from collapsing in like a 5 or 7 year period as we've seen historically, and then identify the crucial policy reforms that have to be elevated above politics, so that if, you know, whether it's any senator or anyone who comes and decides to meddle with that, everybody's going to attack them, because people are like, no, that is a no-go area for us in this country.
Okay. Thank you very much. Fantastic point there, and it's interesting that you brought in the Botswana example. All right, Governor El-Rufai, it's no longer news. We talk about it every day. Rising public debt with the securitization of US dollars. And Nigeria is not smiling to the bank at all for that. We have a lot of things that we cannot afford to pay for right now. How can Nigeria now proceed with these difficult but necessary reforms and retaining the support of the vast majority of Nigerians? Because we did mention earlier that there needs to be communication, there needs also to be trust between the government and the citizens. You also talked about the political class. What will really be the incentive, for heaven's sake, for the political class to lead us right? Like Mr. Igboje said earlier, if you don't have a good driver, the car will not go anywhere. So what will be the incentive for us to have a good driver or a good team?
Well, I gave you the example of 2003 when President Obasanjo said, I want debt relief, do whatever it takes. Often it helps when you have a crisis, okay? When your back is against the wall, when you have no choice but to take hard, difficult decisions. No country wants to go to the IMF, as Indonesia did, and they said never again. But we have backed ourselves against the wall, okay? We don't have any choice. Nigeria must, address those subsidies, the PMS subsidy, the foreign exchange subsidy. They must be addressed tomorrow. Otherwise, we'll end up in the arms of the IMF before the end of the year. I think that that kind of understanding by the political elite will bring everyone to his senses so that we are, as I said earlier, we are realistic about facing our problems and our situation. Sit down and agree that the only way to save the country, the only way to prevent this country going the way of Sri Lanka, for instance, is to absolutely do away with some of these distortions and then try to put all these policies in place that will unleash the competitiveness of Nigerians, that will move the political system towards the 1954 political settlement, for instance. That means, making the federal government smaller, making it less attractive, and, devolving more power, responsibilities, burdens, and revenues to the states.
Okay, thank you, Governor El-Rufai, for that. If you want to attract the people in the private sector to the public sector, I don't think you're going to do that with a 30,000 naira. If there are any big ticket items that you believe, even with our challenges, that we can capitalize on.
Okay. I don't want to run away from the fact that and I will talk about these opportunities, but like I've said, even if the engine of the car has 1 million horsepower, if the driver, the mechanics, the team that handles that car don't have the capacity, forget it. Because it's not just a car running by itself, it's a car running in competition with, others. So the one thing that we must understand is that Nigeria has 3 options. Fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation simply means that if you cannot afford certain things, don't do them. And I'm not saying that it's not good to have a subsidy on fuel if you can afford it. I'm not saying it's not good to subsidize fertilizer inputs if you can afford it. But if you cannot afford it, all you are doing, by afford means, okay, that because stimulate productivity. The subsidies are not meant to be a hole that just keeps getting deeper and deeper. By offering the subsidy, it introduces a level of competition, okay, that basically improves productivity and the wealth of the nation. So fiscal consolidation is remove all the leakages and tighten that budget, okay? Think about profile, 7 trillion naira. Debt stock, 70 trillion naira. Which interest rate do you want to use? Which one now? Which one do you want to use? Inflation, 20%. Okay, so even if we say, okay, fine, you know, we can force people to, you know, lend us money at half, it's 10% at least. So your current revenue profile is just barely enough to service interest. Okay? Then there's nothing left. Okay? The second option, right, if you don't do fiscal consolidation, is debt restructuring. Now,
Shubham is there, so.
Debt restructuring is a very painful process, extremely painful process. I don't advocate it because really, when I say debt restructuring, I'm not saying the genius in President Obasanjo is that he got debt forgiveness. Okay? He restructured his debt in the most miraculous manner. There is a cost to debt restructuring, which is that for the period of restructuring, there's a lot of trauma that the state has to take. The third option is massive private sector investment. Massive private sector investment. That's not going to come by signaling that you are going to increase taxes. No, that's not what you do. Okay? So think about this type of scenario. If every minister that is appointed into the new government, every ambassador that is appointed to a state, a nation, every permanent secretary, every parastatal and so on is given a private sector investment target year by year. Oil and gas targets, education targets, technology targets, agriculture targets, and it's simple. If you don't make your target, assuming, of course, the will is there, let the person leave the place for another person who will go and deliver the target. So those are our three options.
Okay. Dr. Shaduri, let's come to you now. How do you get, with what we've heard right here in the room, and I know your different engagements with people in government, how can various stakeholders now break out of this insular thinking and begin to think that when we come together, we have a larger pie? Unlike what we're seeing right now, the mutual suspicion which you talked about. How do we get people now to understand these profound difficulties, that even in those difficulties, there are opportunities for us? How do we now get them to begin to think with the urgency of acting now?
I think it's largely what Governor El-Rufai, Governor Saludo, they've all said, which is transformational leadership and engagement. Look, this is not something certainly that the World Bank has a technical solution for. What we can say is in what other countries, those have been the factors, ultimately a political solution and a political consensus. What we are happy to say and will keep saying over and over, it's actually, if that one element of consensus can be reached, even about these basic fundamentals. I think Governor Saludo calls them the unsustainables. You know, Nigeria's potential can be unlocked, and then it'll be, you know, kind of self-fulfilling. That once the wider public, everyone begins to see the fruits, I think that itself will be self-sustaining, but there needs to be that initial consensus to begin that process.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Usman, a final response. It's time for us now to get some special interventions, and I'll crave that the ushers are ready with the microphones. Please, let's take our first intervention from Khalifa Muhammad Sanusi II. I'm interested to hear what the Khalifa has got to say today.
I'm not a believer in not blaming. I think if you do well, you get praised. If you do badly, you get blamed. In covering up incompetence, I don't believe in saying that something was not done properly. And if we want to really make progress in this country, we have to learn from the good and the bad. We have to see what we did right, but we also have to look at where we went wrong. And we have to do it in a very smart manner. It doesn't mean that we get mired in this constant attack on individuals, but if we do not understand where we took missteps, where we went off course, we're not likely to get back on course. So where are we today? We're going to have a government sworn in on May 29th. And I think it's time to start saying, what do we expect of that government? What do we as Nigerians believe we should be seeing as a sign that we are heading in the direction that this panel and other panels have talked about over the years? And I would like to basically restrict my comments to about three areas. The first has been talked about, which is competence. If there's one thing Obasanjo did right, and Yar'Adua and Jonathan, I don't want to call names because those you did not call and say, you know, and the next headline is, okay. So, but in general, putting in round pegs in round holes is extremely important. You can have a very, very good minister who's a very competent lawyer. He's not necessarily your best finance minister or your best planning minister. It's not an attack on the person, it's just that you put him in for all of us. You know, we all criticize government, but we also have a duty for all of us. You know, we all criticize government, but we also have a duty of conveying as much as possible the implications of the policies that we recommend. Right, to remove fuel subsidy in 2011. And there were huge debates. And the main issue was, you're going to impose suffering on Nigerians. You're going to increase the price of fuel. And we tried to explain that it was bad economics. For every $1 billion Nigeria spends on fuel subsidy, it is $1 billion out of education, $1 billion out of healthcare, $1 billion out of power, $1 billion out of infrastructure. So don't tell me, oh, I'm going to increase the price of fuel. Come out and say what you are saying. What you are saying is that for the poor people of this country, cheap fuel is more important than education, more important than healthcare, more important than power. And if you do that for 30, 40 years, what kind of country are you going to have? Which is what we have had. I've always said, if you take fuel subsidy as an example, that we have never had fuel subsidy. We've had a hedge, okay? And a naked hedge. And I will tell you, in finance, the worst hedge you take is a naked hedge. You know, a subsidy is you say, okay, if the price is X, we'll pay 20% of it. That's a subsidy. But if I tell you, you will never pay more than X, for a product whose price I do not control, it doesn't matter whether oil price is $200 or $150 a barrel or $100 a barrel, the Nigerian government has it will fund the difference. The exchange rate can move from 150 to 500 naira. The Nigerian government has, and it will fund you. It's stupidity. You're heading to bankruptcy.
But I would just like to maybe highlight a few things they've said and look at it differently. Yes, we need to study that period where we witnessed episodic growth. The government that Malam Nasri was part of, that Charles was part of, and we had a lot of excellent people in. But I think what political science also teaches is that the nature of transition itself will be responsible for whether we get transformational leadership or we get mere political reconfiguration. And that's the reason why President Obasanjo was not able to do that in his first term. He had ministers that were the products of the pact that produced him in 1999. But he gained a lot more wiggle room in 2003 to bring in the type of people that he felt would help him deliver the goods. And he pretty much succeeded on that count. Until Nigeria realizes that a winner-takes-all political structure is not going to give us the kind of settlement that will produce tough decisions that we want to see, I don't think we're going to get there. For me, we're still along the journey of political alternatives. We have not yet reached alternative politics yet. When we reach alternative politics, then we will be able to deal with all these issues, because competence is great. And we got competent ministers in that period that we talked about. But what made competent ministers deliver on the goods was not so much that. Malamasi said something. He said we didn't have to worry about the politics. President Obasanjo handled the politics for us. So you can be competent, you can be committed, you can be compassionate, but if you're lacking in courage in politics to take the tough, unpopular decisions, we're not going to get anywhere. If we're going to build a better, competent, more organized country, it has to be a coalition of the willing. And we need to bring every serious-minded people on board. I have been an advocate of a government of national competence, but a government of national competence that is also the product of our variegated political structures. So a government of national competence is not necessarily a negation of a government of national unity. It's how we arrive at it that will determine whether we achieve the purpose that we are all very keen to achieve with this exercise.
And that's it on today's edition of the program. I hope you were not fatigued with a whole lot of things that you heard right there from the panelists, but that was how it went down just a few days ago. After moderating the conversation, I actually went out thinking, okay, we know our problems, we know the obstacles. It seems we also know the solutions. So what exactly is stopping us from moving ahead? So I leave that to you. I am Nancy Nnaji. Be the best you can be, be the change that you want to see. I'll see you all again next time.